Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for this second part of my conversation with Amanda Paterson, Avro Heritage Museum Trustee. Today, we're going to be hearing in a lot more detail about the challenges of bringing the Nimrod MRA4 project to Woodford. And Amanda will look back on the cancellation of the contract in 2010, recalling her colleague Nigel Whitehead's invitation to a fateful meeting with the British Prime Minister. We also get to know about her dad, Johnny Walker, a Lancaster bomber pilot and subsequently an Avro production flight test pilot and commercial airline pilot. But we started off with Nimrod MRA4, and I asked Amanda whether bringing the project to Woodford was to help secure the longer-term future for the site.
Yes, although that wasn't the company's driver. It wasn't initially about saving Woodford. It was about saving the project, saving the program. So, but there was a double benefit to it in so much as Woodford's always had an involvement in Nimrod, in previous variants, the MR2, Project Annika, and we had a lot of that large aircraft experience still within the organisation in terms of people, particularly in the design and engineering organisations that had been involved in some of the previous conversion programmes. And we also had them across the company down at Filton. But for lots of various reasons, the project was originally structured around as a design and build type concept where the design was being led out of Wharton and the company had subcontracted production to FRA Aviation down at Bournemouth. But because of lots of issues around the design, lots of iterations, lots of changes, obviously the company was sort of hemorrhaging money in terms of keeping the production side of things going. The number of stop-starts on, around changing decisions. So we were asked to support the putting together a business case to bring that project in-house into Woodford. And I was asked to jointly lead it, on behalf of Woodford with a couple of my colleagues at Wharton. So we went through the various stages of it. First of all was a very top-level business case, and then once that had passed various approval stages, we tapped into lots of that knowledge around the organisation as to what we needed to think about in terms of how Woodford could deliver the project in support of the Wharton organisation. So fast forwarding, once the business case had been approved, before we could actually get even bring a fuselage into Woodford, there were some incredibly exciting challenges that we had to deliver, basically. So it involved modification of some of the hangars and the staging, involved installing new floors on the hangars to accommodate the staging around the aircraft. It was on this sort of floating air system. I forget the name now, it might come back to me, but we had to put in a very shiny floor in order for the float system to operate successfully. We had to install all sorts of upgraded electrics, both sides of the runway, and I think in order to accommodate the IT system, there was a particular challenge as to how we were then going to transport all of the fuselages that were already in mid-phase production at Bournemouth into Woodford. And so one of the most interesting things that I've had to do in my career is arrange a fleet of Antonovs to fly the fuselages up from Bournemouth into Woodford. And we actually flew 4, because there were, I think at the time, 4 aircraft already on the line at Bournemouth. The 5th, we actually flew in as an MR2, and we flew that into Woodford before we then stripped down to fuselage. So yeah, I had, I was involved in organising this kind of whole logistics project of transferring 4 part-built fuselages and everything that went with them into Woodford. And the other part of it that was also positive but challenging was to do this in a cooperative and very cooperative and amenable way with FRA in order to maintain a positive relationship with an organisation that we needed to stay friendly with in future. So we needed to be sort of continuous and seamless transition. So yeah, quite a quite a complicated project management exercise to do all of that. And then obviously another part was ensuring, breaking out and setting up a separate organisation from what was this sort of 146RJ activity at Woodford at the time, and having an organisation ready to hit the ground running once the line arrived back at Woodford.
I'm sure there's a multiplicity of reasons why things didn't work out. Do you remember the day when the contract was cancelled?
I do, but just finishing the story, my involvement with Nimrod probably ended once we'd actually brought the project to Woodford and got things running. I then did not play an ongoing role in the operational side of the Nimrod programme. And at that point, that was actually when I moved to Chadderton. So very timely, I think. It was like, what next for Amanda? And I was actually at Chadderton when the project was cancelled. I do remember that day. I was actually at Wharton, and I remember Nigel, and he'd been summoned to London. I can't remember exactly where it was. It was probably somewhere in Westminster, locked in a room, and then called to meet Cameron when that decision was made. And we all knew something was coming, and I guess the speculation, was correct. But, whilst I was very, very invested during that 2-year period of bringing the project to Woodford, I'd moved on by then and had other worries and other things to worry about. And, it was nothing like, for me, probably was nothing as traumatic as an experience for all the people that had then started work on the programme and had tried the hardest to make it a successful programme. And indeed, it had turned a corner. We actually had, several MRA4s in the flying, operational. So really, the project, I think, is, I don't know, I don't want to get political, but, it was the decision to cancel the project at that point seemed strange when it could have been cancelled so much earlier. Or, we could have got the full fleet delivered and airborne because that was in sight. So, for a lot of my colleagues, it was devastating. And then to have to watch the scrapping of the fleet at Woodford and the subsequent closure. I wasn't at Woodford by then. I was elsewhere in the organisation, very conscious of it happening, but I didn't have to see it on a day-to-day basis, which I'm quite thankful for, really, because I think I'd have been, as upset as many of my colleagues.
To begin to round off, Amanda, tell us a little bit about your dad, because you touched on your dad right at the beginning. You said that was a big part of your life, big background. Tell us a little bit about his wartime role briefly, and his role at Avro as well.
Okay. Well, my dad was a very private man, very clever man. And I was always conscious that he didn't talk much about the war years. And I think that's quite common, that when they've been through so much, it's, they don't share many of the stories. But I gradually sort of was able to talk to him and get him to tell me a few of the stories. But more importantly, he let me look at his logbooks. And, I learned a lot of it just from reading the timelines and the records in his logbooks. But he basically did 2 tours on Lancasters in the war. I think he joined up in 1919. So he joined up as a 20-year-old in 1940, trained, did all of his training, on various other types, but then did 2 tours on Lancs in 1941 and 42. Survived the 2 tours, and then so therefore was offered the opportunity to leave. And he joined, having been brought up in the area. I think he was very familiar with Woodford. He was born and bred in Cheetah-Hulme, so he came to Woodford as a production flight test pilot, which he joined the flight test organisation, but he was a flight test pilot between back end of 42 and the end of the war. And so his role then was test flying the Lancasters off the line. I remember one story he told me was, I think because of weather, there was possibly a backlog, but I know one day he told me that he did 12 first flights in a day. And so quite an important role. I don't know how many he test flew of the 7,000, but, certainly his role was taking them up, giving them a 15-minute shakedown and landing them again and moving on to the next one. That was his role at the end of the war. And then obviously after that, he continued at Woodford as a flight test pilot, a development flight test pilot, until I think he was made redundant in about 1950. And that basically was the beginning of his commercial flying role. So I think in the early days, he was flying out, doing a lot of work in Africa and India on DC-3s. And then he actually joined BEA, British European Airways, at its inception, actually, and subsequently transitioned into British Airways when that was formed with the merger of BEA and BOAC. Became a senior training captain. But he came back to Woodford. He came with me on several occasions to air shows. And then once the museum had been established, I know he was invited back on several occasions to talk to the historians and the archivists and share some of his stories with them. So for me, it's just, it brings it round full circle for me. So having been invited to join the museum and to become a trustee, it's quite fitting and poignant for me that every time I come back, my father's photograph is on the wall. So, I often point it out to people when they say, well, what's your involvement and what's your interests? And I say, well, it's both my personal involvement as, having had 35 years in my career with BAE Systems in various forms and roles, but also, in tribute to my father who actually played quite a role in the Lancaster story. I suppose the only thing I'd like to just wrap up on, if that's all right, is, you've asked me a lot about the stages of my career. I suppose what I'd like to just reflect on and finish on is that, the 35 years I was with British Aerospace and BAE Systems, I've had the most fantastic career. It offered me so many opportunities. I was lucky to be in a position to take those opportunities up. Everything seemed to fall well for me, but I was able to have a family during that time, but also be a career woman. I've been around the world. I've been to some really interesting places. I've worked with some fabulous people, and I probably will say particularly at Woodford and Chatterton, salt of the earth, and, some great teams. I don't regret any of it. I want to finish on a positive because I know we talked about some of the early challenges, but for me it was a great place to work, and I would encourage other people to look at aerospace as a career. It's a great opportunity, whether you come in and as a technical graduate or into the other sides of the business. But I would encourage anybody who's thought about it to pursue it, because it is a most incredible career.
Would you have advice for young people in that position in terms of how best to go about it?
Follow your strengths and don't be put off by, feeling that you are, being in a minority, because if you're good at it, you'll succeed because you're good. I think now a lot of the barriers have gone. You won't find, I don't think there's any discrimination in terms of any barriers to progression, and the support is there for you to have a good work-life balance if you wish to combine a career with having a family, because, the opportunities are there for you to go back to however long you choose to take off, to have that family, but the support is there for people to be able to do to combine the both nowadays.
My other question, which I think in a sense you've answered, was to say if there were a couple of periods in that long career that you could go back to that hold the fondest memories, and perhaps also the ones where you feel you really achieved an awful lot. Are there any particular periods that spring to mind of those sort of golden days?
The two things I'm most proud of was my involvement in bringing Nimrod to Woodford and just seeing that Antonov. I wasn't able to fly on the first one, so some of my colleagues had to fly with the aeroplane. So I waved it off at Bournemouth, jumped in the car and chased up to Woodford. But of course, I wasn't here to see it land. But I was able to be here to see the fourth one land. So that was a very proud moment. And then the second one isn't a particular moment; it's a period of time, and that is my time at Chatterton. Just, absolutely loved being in that role, having that responsibility, having the team, the involvement in the community, and our place in BAE Systems. It was a great time to be.
We like to think on these podcasts that we engage people and provide interesting things. We like to think that we inform them. We like to think that we inspire them. So thank you, because I think you've done all three of those in a brilliant way today. So we really do appreciate you.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Thank you very much. Thanks once again to Amanda for sharing all those experiences over that long career, and for her reflections and wise advice to young people, young women in particular, who might aspire to follow in her footsteps. That's all we have time for today. Please like or subscribe to the podcast and make sure you enable notifications on your device. And then you'll receive an alert as soon as a new episode becomes available. And if you know someone who might well be interested in the Avro story, then please share the podcast with them. We hope that you'll join us again soon, but for now, it's cheerio from me, Chris Beswick. Bye-bye.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.